result of this collaboration from private appropriation. So I'm going to get back to this in more detail. The only thing I want to say that's important at this stage is think about the whole of human history. In the whole of human history, if you are a tribe, with a few hundred people, and you're faced with a centralized empire, who's going to lose? The tribe. Yeah, and the small empire is going to lose from the big empire. And SME is going to lose from multinational. So basically we have a long, long history after the tribal era where hierarchy trumps distribution and decentralization. I'm arguing, I call this peak hierarchy, by analogy of peak oil, if you know what peak oil means, right? So the theory that we are basically used up more than half of the oil reserves. Peak hierarchy basically says that there's a shift, and the shift is that today, if you use distributed forms of organization, you're going to be stronger than if you use centralized forms of organization. Now, if we look at existing peer production projects like Linux or Wikipedia, and we study how these things are organized, these are not centrally organized processes with a command and control hierarchy. Most of this free software is produced with teams from 1 to 4 people. But the new thing is that they are now able to globally coordinate themselves and to make substantial social artifacts which can compete with public and private forms of producing value. So that's very important. If you're familiar with the Dunbar number, which basically says that the average human being is able to process about 120 human relationships. And then it reaches a level of complexity where you can no longer manage a higher number of relationships. Dunbar, the anthropology, also says that historically, whenever you have more than 500 people in a complex arrangement, you need a hierarchy to sustain that arrangement, right? Now here we have something very new. We have a system that allows the global scaling of small group dynamics and the global coordination of small groups that are united in creating a certain thing or artifact or product that they want to make together, right? At the very least, this is the first effect. We have now a way of imagining the production of value that is no longer as industrial age, a very simple binary choice. Shall we do it the private way, through corporations and private property, or shall we do it the public way, with regulation, centralization, planning, or whatever, right? Now at least we have a triple way of imagining how we can produce social value. We can still produce it publicly, privately, but we can also do it commonly through civil society groups which self-aggregate through peer production. I want to go into some details about how different peer production is from traditional ways of conceiving production and governance. First, I want to say a few words about the details of how it works. And I think the underlying ontology, if you like, there's a kind of a shift in how we conceive human beings. And I define this after I guess you could call him philosopher, Georges Ferrer, is a professor in San Francisco. He calls it equipotentiality. So what is equipotentiality? You can read it with me. So you experience people as being a collection of varying skills and endeavors. And in some things you're better than somebody else, and in some other things somebody else is better than you. But none of this defines you as better as a whole, as a human being, than another human being. So once you start conceiving people in that way, in an equipotential way, what you deduce from that kind of basic decision is, well, everybody will be good at something. So maybe we can imagine a social system which allows people to directly connect what they perceive as their potential and skill to a social process or something that needs to be done collectively. And that's what peer production is about. So peer production basically abandons the idea of a division of labor. Right? The industrial process says, this is what we need to do, here are a number of tasks, we make it into a function, a job, and we try to find the best people to do the job. Right? And we have a filtering process to find the best people for the job. Peer production says, we'll conceive a production process as a modular, granular series of as granular as possible tasks. We broadcast it in some way, and we allow people to self-select their equipotential contribution to the collective task. And in some way, the underlying philosophy of peer production is not to say, let's go from selfish interest to altruist. It's actually saying, can we design social systems that harmonize the individual and the collective interest, so that my interest in, let's say, Theravada Buddhism, and writing an article about it for the Wikipedia, harmonizes with the collective projects of creating a universal encyclopedia. Or my interest in solving a particular software problem harmonizes with the collective projects of creating an alternative operating system. Right? And this is what peer production does. It designs social systems to try to harmonize individual and collective interests in a way that the market does not. The market doesn't do that. The market assumes that will happen after the fact, right? We engage in an exchange out of self-interest, and the theory goes that will eventually create collective interest. Peer production builds it inside the design of the production process itself, right? So I would argue a market is like swarming of insects. Yeah, the individual insect doesn't know about the collective. The individual trader doesn't know about the collective. But in peer production, it's an object-oriented sociality. You are making something together. You are making an encyclopedia together. You are making an alternative operating system together. It's built in the reason why you congregate. So no division of labor. Also, no exclusion. So it's a design based on universal participation. How can we design a social system, a productive system that does not exclude? So peer production abandons credentialism, which is the basis of the university, right? In a university you can participate if you have been a priori selected as being able to participate. So all these system of controls, which are typical of modernity, basically if we look at the history of knowledge, pre-modern feudal systems, etc., are based on protecting information within a particular group. You have the guilds, you have the church, right? Nobody's free to read the Bible. It's protected. Modernity says, no, we should open it up, right? We create the Encyclopedia of Diderot, and everybody can see what before only the guilds knew. But then we say, well, how do we select for quality and excellence? How do we make sure that these things work? By creating a priori selection mechanism that we call credentialing. And we abandon this in peer production. In peer production we say, we are not going to test you. You can permissionlessly contribute to the collective project, and we put the selection process at the end. So we have at the end a communal validation process that selects out of those contributions what contributes best to what is relevant to the project, which can be different, right? If you go to the moon, and they use Linux to go to the moon today, people die, right? So that means very stringent quality control issues. But if you write a Wikipedia and there is a mistake about yourself, you'll feel bad, but you won't die. So it will be a loop. So the object of production determines what kind of governance is needed and what kind of selection mechanisms are needed for that. I think we also leave the idea of products behind. Industrial method is about creating products that for sale, right? Firefox, for example, is an infinitely improving piece of software when can you say so it's finished? It's never finished. It's continuously improved upon. So we move from product to infinite process. It's never perfect, it's never finished, but it's always improving. That's the idea. The whole idea of information is different, right? In any modern process, it's need to know. Everybody knows what he needs to know to carry out the task. And so you have a hierarchy of access to knowledge which culminates in the top, which supposedly, of course that's not true, but supposedly has to know everything. And the lower you go in hierarchical process of contribution, the less you know. By design, peer production processes are totally transparent. Any change of code, any change of content, you can see. It's been designed for totally open transparency, and we call it holoptism, meaning from any point in the process you have access to the totality of knowledge. Of course, in reality, we can't know everything, that's for sure. But it's designed that way. It's designed so that if you want to, and you're willing to make an effort, you can find out. So again, if you work in any corporation, the default option is not sharing, and you make an effort to share. In a peer production process, the default option is sharing. You have to make an effort not to share, because the design is about the sharing is kind of inherent. Now, I want to make some fairly strong claims about this, and I would argue that peer production is hyper-productive compared to private and public modes of production. And why would that be? Why would Wikipedia have basically pushed aside the Britannica? Why does free software make Steve Ballmer say that Windows 7 is the very last operating system they can build in a proprietary mode? Why would they say that? Why is Firefox improving all the time and Internet Explorer with so much more money is barely trying to follow the improvements that Firefox is making every day? Why are these things so productive? One way to explain it is by looking at motivation. And so basically the story is, if you have a pre-modern system of production, slavery, feudalism, tributary systems, we are talking about coercive cooperation, right? If you don't give me all your production if you're a slave, or half of your production if you're a serf, we cut your head off or we cut your hand. Basically, that's the kind of underlying truth of those social systems. So it's negative, extrinsic motivation. It's very easy to understand in such a social system, if the boss is not looking, you're not going to work. Because it's not in your interest, right? So these systems need very heavy control systems, armies, to make people work. We can argue a little bit idealistically, I admit, that capitalism as a system says, well, what if we change negative extrinsic motivation with positive extrinsic motivation? It's still coming from the outside, but instead of fear, it's self-interest, right? So we assume, and correctly I think, that if we can work in our own interest, we are going to work harder. And we assume in capitalism that we exchange equal value through market pricing. And absolutely, this is a more productive system. We can see historically that once we adopt these modes, productivity explodes. But I think there's still inherent weaknesses in the market mode. For example, what I said before, right? In the market mode, we have two parties in the transaction. I look for my interest, you look for your interest. We're both happy, we made an exchange, but we don't think about the system as a whole. It's just not part of the DNA of that transaction that we look to the outside. So our system has serious problem with externalities. Social and environmental externalities are not part of the logic of a market system, they are outside of it. Second thing is, well, if I don't get it, if I don't get an exchange, I'm not going to do it. So if you don't pay me, I'm not going to work. Right? And you can see in some countries, a lot of people sitting outside and they don't have work because there's no money, and they're not going to work because there's no money. So this is a weakness. And I think a third weakness is, well, I'm not going to draw it. I'll just make a virtual slide. Think about innovation. Innovation in a market system is relative. Yeah? You want to be better than the other guy. One corporation has to innovate to compete with another market player. And so we are always striving for relative quality. So if you like, the innovation process in a market system is like stairs, right? You innovate, then you try to protect your innovation as long as you can. And if you have a monopoly, which is very often the case, there's no need to innovate, right? So after Netscape collapses, Microsoft Explorer basically stays static for 7 years. There was no reason. Then Firefox comes along, and suddenly Internet Explorer is innovating. So the striving is relative quality. It does innovate, but it's limited because of that reason. A peer production community doesn't strive for relative quality, it strives for absolute quality. Let's make the best possible alternative operating system we can make. Let's make the best possible browser we can make. So what happens if you have one player trying to aim for relative quality, and you're faced with a player who aims for absolute quality? Well, that's what's happening with today, right? We see that if you have a corporation using proprietary intellectual property, having to pay everybody who works for them, and on the other hand, you have a community like Firefox, associated with the for-benefit institution, the Mozilla Foundation, associated with a number of companies that work around that particular commons, that it works better because its innovation is simply continuous, while the other one is discontinuous. So, to make a little provocative example, if we would assume, and I'll argue for this later, that a particular peer-producing community says, I want to make an open source fridge. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not in a year, maybe not even in 3 years. But I predict that at a certain point you will have a choice between the perfect open source fridge and a deficient, actually purposely designed to be inefficient, private fridge, right? So, okay, absolute quality, right? Versus relative quality. I think I didn't finish my story about motivation, because what about motivation is the following. Peer production is structurally designed to eliminate negative extrinsic motivation and positive extrinsic motivation. So basically you are left with what psychologists know is the most efficient form of motivation, intrinsic, positive motivation. Of course, this poses a number of problems, especially at the individual level. Collectively, if you have a successful peer production project, it is sustainable as long as you can replace the people who lose passion with people who gain passion, right? So let's assume you lose 10% of your people working for Wikipedia. As long as you gain another 10%, as a project you are sustainable. But as an individual, on the individual level, you are not sustainable because your passion production, especially if it's not paid, is not sustainable. So I'll come back to that issue. A few words about peer property. So I try to explain the characteristics of peer production. Just a few words about peer property. Individual property, the logic is very simple, right? If it's mine, it's not yours. Public property says it's from all of us, but we have a representational mechanism which allows us to decide what happens with that property. So there is still a factor of exclusion that's inherent in public property. In common property, we're saying something different. We are saying it's mine, it's yours, and everybody can use it. Right? So if you look at a general public license, what does it do? It says anybody can use this open code, open source code, this free software code. But anything you do with it has to go back to that pool. And by definition, everybody has access to it. So you can't exclude anybody from access to that common pool. This is by the very definition of that license. Another form of license is the Creative Commons type license. It's a little bit different, and the way I explain it is that we have a sharing economy and a commons economy. And let me try to explain the difference. In the sharing economy, I could use something as an individual or as a group, and I want to share it with you. So what the Creative Commons does is basically give you a capacity to modulate your level of sharing. There are about 6 main ways you can use the Creative Commons, right? And it basically allows you to choose how far you allow the sharing to occur. While a true commons format, like the general public license, basically says, yeah, you can use it, but everything you change goes back to the common pool. So the difference is, again, the difference actually is in the object. So to have true commons-based peer production, you need a common object. And it's going to determine different social relationships. So if you only share, if you're only in there for sharing your production, right, like in YouTube or Flickr, what's going to happen in network theory terms is that you're going to have weak links with the other sharers. And this weak community dynamic invites a third party to create a platform, because you can't do it by yourself, right? So in the sharing economy, we see people sharing, but private companies actually maintaining and developing the sharing platforms, right? But already we're talking about a new form of capitalism, because the traditional form of capitalism is, I pay you, it's going to cost me something, I'm going to sell it for a higher price, and that's how I make money. So you're producing something, right? But Google, YouTube, Flickr are companies who are no longer producing the value themselves. So already we have a form of production where it's the people that create the value, but it's the proprietary platforms which capture the value. And what they capture is your attention, right? So you're sharing. It's not a market. YouTube is not a market. Google Documents is not a market. Flickr is not a market. But your attention is a market, right? And basically, those companies make money, and then they fund the development of the sharing platform, right? And there's a kind of underlying social contract which says, okay, I'm happy that you do that for me so I can share, but don't, give me my freedom or I go somewhere else. This is kind of the underlying social contract. In true commons-based peer production, like we have in Wikipedia or Linux, it's a little different. You are making something together. So, I want to write an article for Wikipedia. I say Obama is great. And you're a Republican, and you say Obama sucks. Okay. If you want the article to exist, you have somehow to arrive at a consensus. You may not like the person, probably don't, right? But the very dynamic of common production forces you to interact. And so empirically, what we see is that in true commons-based peer production, we see that the community is strong enough to create its own platforms. Now, how do they do that? By creating non-profit institutions, which I would call for-benefit institutions. I don't like to say non-profit, you're from non-profit, right? Oxfam. Because non-profit kind of says, well, profit is first, but we are non-profit, right? Or non-governmental says, this is government, we are non-government. No. We are for something. We are for benefit. We want to create a true common object. We are for benefit institution. And the third player is a number of businesses that work with that common value. So the logic is the following. And if you like, the important thing is to distinguish the sphere of abundance from the sphere of scarcity. The sphere of abundance is the sphere of the creation of this intellectual value. Yeah? You have individuals, they have their brains, they have computers, and they have access to the networks. Because they control their own means of production, they can voluntarily self-aggregate permissionlessly and say, I will work on this project. Now this is abundant. And there's an abundance of, and once you create it, it stays abundant because it's, it's marginal cost of reproduction, right, in the digital realm. Nevertheless, in order to do that, you need servers, and the more success you have, the more you need servers. So there's a cost associated with cooperation, which is scarce because it needs cost recovery mechanism. And this is where a non-profit comes in. So the Apache Foundation, the Wikimedia Foundation, the Mozilla Foundation are institutions that manage the infrastructure of cooperation. But they do not manage the process of peer production. And this is a true innovation because as much as I love non-profits, usually they reproduce in many ways the hierarchical way of doing things because they operate from a point of view of scarcity. Yeah? We have a certain amount of resources and you want to allocate that in an intelligent way, and there's a power structure. If you design for abundance, in a way what you're doing is you preempt the conflict. We don't have to fight over who's going to do what. We'll both do what we want, and then there's a process of communal validation after the fact. So the non-profit foundations that manage the infrastructure of cooperation don't have the power over the production process itself, right? Nobody in the Wikimedia Foundation can tell anybody to write an article for the Wikipedia. It doesn't work that way. And nobody can say, oh, you can't write that. It doesn't work that way. Okay, maybe I say one word about the business side of it. The problem for a business is the following. Openness creates value, but closeness captures the value. So as a corporation, you always have a mixed gene pool, I would say, right? You have the dolphin DNA, which says, I have to create an open platform so that people can share, etc., etc. But you also have shark genes, right? And the shark genes say, well, if I make it totally open, then somebody else will capture it. I don't have any control over this value, and somebody else will run away with it. Therefore, I need to close down certain aspects of this openness that gives me a control over the value creation process, right? So as a company, you always have this dual, you see it, Amazon, eBay, they continuously try to enclose, and then the people protest, and then they open up again. Sometimes they open up by themselves because they're competing with another, because they want to create more value. Openness creates value. So they'll open up as a way of competing with a more closed competitor. And so we have a dynamic balance between a community of peer producer or sharers and a proprietary platform in the sharing model. And we have a balance between community, non-profit foundation, and business in the commons form. So the kind of open business model, if you like, is you take the commons, you create a layer of added value that you can make scarce, and that's the way you operate in the market, right? But if you want to keep a good relationship with the community, you have to practice benefit sharing, not profit sharing. The reason is that if you rely on voluntary aggregation, voluntary contribution, privileging some people over others actually destroys that dynamic, right? So if it has been tried many times, I think it was Yahoo search and I forgot which, maybe Google search, Yahoo Answers and another system, right? And I think it was Yahoo said, well, we'll pay people. Guess what? Less people contributed after they paid than before. Because the people then start saying, well, I don't want to contribute, and then you get rich and I stay poor, right? So you can actually practice direct profit sharing in a commons-oriented peer production mode because it actually undermines and crowds out the process. Benefit sharing is how can I sustain as a company the commons from which I derive the value. And therefore I will fund the non-profit. That's usually how it happens. So IBM will give money to the Linux Foundation and to the Free Software Foundation. And that way they sustain the infrastructure of cooperation from which they derive a large part of their value, and they just keep on adding value-added layers. Okay, now we come to a very important issue. first. And the question is the following. Okay, granted that you're convinced by my arguments, and you say, yeah, this is true, and it will work, but for sure, it will work for software, it will work for encyclopedias, but it's not going to work for a car, right? So we'll have peer production in the immaterial sphere, but we'll still have good old for-profit capitalist production in the material sphere. And I think this is not the case, and I'll try to make a few arguments for that. So basically, I want to show you why peer production will also fundamentally alter the way we produce physical things. And the first argument is the following. Anything you need to produce physically needs to be designed immaterially. And there's no fundamental difference. There's some practical difference, but there's no fundamental difference between designing a piece of software and designing a car. We talk about brains working with computers with access to the networks. In both cases, anything that needs to be produced physically needs to be designed, right? And what I've seen, so what I do with the P2P Foundation is, monitoring those emergencies, right? And about 6 months ago, I saw it didn't start 6 months ago, but it's kind of restarted 6 months ago, which is basically an increasing number of communities designing physical products. Wired last month had the case study of Arduino, which makes circuit boards. There's a Neuro OS television set. I have 120 of them, right? And that indicates to me that the same process of open software design is moving to the field of physical production. Okay, they can't produce the car by themselves, but they can design the car. So really what we can imagine is a community of people designing environmental, let's say green energy, solar roofs, actually already exist. And on the other hand, we have a player that will say, I'll make it. It's not, and basically it's the same system as we have in free software. IBM sells stuff, right? Using the open commons of free software. And we'll have a company making fridges using the open commons of fridge design. I think it's an entirely feasible and to be expected development in the evolution of peer production. Absolutely, it's emergent, it's a seed right now, but we see it starting, and we see it starting to work. So it's going to be emulated. Another important thing is the what I would call the general tendency for the means of production to be distributed. So basically, the reason we have peer production in computing, in software, knowledge, is because we have computers, right? And they become smaller and smaller to the point where an average individual, at least in the West, can purchase a computer, and we have access to a socialized network, the internet, and that's all we needed to have self-aggregating voluntary contribution, because we control our own means of production. The same thing is now happening in the field of capital goods. I won't go into details, but we have something like mail order machining. Yeah, you can send a design to a company like eMachine Shop, and they'll make it for you. And they'll send it by mail in a truck, right? You have 3D printing. You have, admittedly, this is very early on, personal fabricators. We have already in industry rapid tooling, rapid prototyping. So the vision is that the same evolution we had in computers is going to happen in capital goods. We are going to be able, I take biology, synthetic biology. A machine 3 years ago was about $25,000. Today it's about $4,000. Right? So the price of these things are going down. At the same time, peak oil, etc., we have, okay, now we have a crisis, oil is going down, but that's kind of a short-term evolution. We have, in the long term, a rising price of energy goods. What does that tell us? One possible scenario is the following. We'll have open design communities coupled with relocalized production. I think this is an entirely realistic way of expectations for the next 10, 15, 20 years. Open design communities, globally organized, and more entities producing physical things on the local level because of the crisis of material globalization. We are faced with a crisis of extensive globalization. If China and India want to have the Western level, we need 4 planets, we don't have it. So this is a fundamental limitation for the current globalization model. And it's not historically unprecedented. I'd like to use a historic analogy about the end of the Roman Empire. So the basic logic is the following. The raw material for a slave-based empire is slaves, which means you need to conquer new lands all the time because they only live about 30 years old. And at some point in the history of an empire, the cost of expansion becomes bigger than the benefit of the new supply of slaves, right? So what you then have is basically like in the market, the price of slaves go up. And the empire gets in trouble and a new empire replaces the old empire. Except in the West. What happened was that this enlightened slave owners said, well, if I free my slaves, instead of 1,000 supervisors, I need only 100, and they can, work on the land, and instead of giving everything, they'll only give 50. I only get 50%, but they'll be so more productive because they're working for themselves. They're sustaining their own family, right? So this idea, if you like, became the basis of a total reorientation of the system towards feudalism, which was based on relocalized production around the domain, but with the Catholic Church as a global open design community, right? In some ways, we can imagine it, right? And that's basically the kind of image I'd like to share. So, but I'm not saying, careful, I'm not saying, I'm not a survivalist. I'm not even an ecologist really. These will be high-tech communities, very high-tech local production. So it's not a rigorous express, right? It's not about going back to an earlier. It's actually a reorientation about very high technology, but relocalized tooling that will allow more localized production, but still in the context of an intellectual and cultural globalization. How much time do I have?
It's 5 to 5.
All right, another 5 minutes?
Okay.
I think we started it, right? Okay, this is kind of a slide. It's another way to make the same argument, basically. And, so, what we have here? We have an axis free versus paid. Free goods and paid goods, right? And we have an axis open intellectual property versus closed intellectual property. This is the old way of doing things. We use closed intellectual property and we sell the goods on the market. Now, this is especially problematic when we enter the field of immaterial production, right? Because what happens is the investment to produce something new can be fairly high. Think about a movie or designing a new car. Yes, very expensive. But the design, the information, is very cheap to reproduce. So what is happening there? What is happening there is what's called a freemium economy by some people. In other words, for every entity in the market that says, I'll make something, I'll protect it, and I'll sell it, another entity says, well, I'll give it away. And basically what they're doing is they're giving the primary good away, and they build a set of secondary services around it. And we see that everywhere. Think about stock market information. 10 years ago, it cost about $7,000 to get a subscription to real-time stock information, right? And then what happened was somebody said, I'll give it for free with a 15-minute delay. And only a few months later, somebody said, I'll give it for free. I live from the advertising. So this is happening on a substantial scale. Okay, this is another another option. So what you do here is you open up the source code, but you still want to get paid. So this is basically open source economy, right? This is the economy of Red Hat, IBM, people who say the source code is free, but you need to pay for integration, development, some extra layer of software which is not free and which is sold together with the package. Again, it's very hard for those to survive, as you know, when you have a competitor like that. So what happens in the free software field is very typical. Linux has created $35 billion economy, I think on an annual basis. But it destroys $70 billion in private software. Right? It's a very disruptive business model. So if you're here, Microsoft, you're dead. You're dead. It's finished. The game is over, because whenever you have a player that does that or that, you're in deep trouble. Right? And this is why this is the disruption that we are living today. Asymmetrical competition between those type of players, which really want to hold on intellectual property and use legal and technical means to basically create artificial scarcity, because you can't copy it for free. So the only way they can stop you is putting you in jail or sabotaging your machine. And none of these things really work very well, right? Okay, there's a fourth one. My daughter is 21. She doesn't have a lot of money, neither do I. And she wants to travel, right? What does she do? She goes to couchsurfing.com, right? A worldwide system of exchange of lodging for free. So here we have open source code and gratis, right? And this is also happening. There is an enormous emergence of sharing sites, FreeCycle. There's thousands of them, and they're emerging in the whole world, and are actually creating a type of economy which we could call post-monetary. Okay, we could go on about this. I just want to show how disruptive peer production can be, even when you just think of it as an integrated part of the capitalist economy, right? It's really changing the whole conception of doing business, and this is not something that's going to happen in a few years. It's actually happening now. Okay, there's one model I didn't mention, which is the crowdsourcing model. The difference is the following. In the crowdsourcing model, you are basically not relying on communities to produce use value, but they create exchange value directly. In other words, iStock photo, right? People put pictures there because they want to sell them, and you have a commercial entity which kind of acts as a marketplace. So this is the third model, which is different from the sharing and the commons model. Okay. There's, in my view, a lot of good things about peer production, but it's also a serious problem. And I'll try to define the problem, and that will be the end of my presentation. I call it the crisis of value. And it's a great problem for the capitalist system, and it's a great problem for the people who work. And it's really, that's on the slide, is the following. We now have a system which allows for the exponential growth of the direct creation of use value. Yeah? Think about YouTube, 100 million videos are watched every single day and growing. This is all use value. So people are no longer using the market to create, they do it directly on those sharing platforms. But how much money is YouTube making? Relatively little, right? So what we have is a system which has democratized the means of self-expression, but has not democratized the means of the rewards of the self-expression. And while we have an exponential growth of use value creation, we only have a linear growth of market monetization. This is a serious problem. Think about Google again, another example. Google is making a good amount of money, but how many websites can live from Google advertising? Very few, right? So this is a serious problem of sustainability of people who produce this kind of value. Right? So we're kind of facing a situation whereby within the current system we don't have an answer to this challenge. It's happening, we can't stop it. At the same time, the current system is somehow not able to integrate it and to really use it and to promote it. This is not a marginal affair. There's a study that just came out about a Swedish city called Malmö, and it concluded that 68% of the population is actively engaged in peer production. People are doing it. They're creating all kinds of stuff together, right? And so one of the things that we have in Europe, and I'm sure you have in the United States, is an increased precarity of young people. And there's many reasons for it, but one of the reasons is that people are looking for meaningful activities and they're not getting it in a market system. And therefore they're devising survival mechanisms that, okay, I'll work for a project, I want to make money, but I also want to get out of it because I want to engage in this meaningful, passionate production, right? And this is something we need. We need to find mechanisms that allow this to happen in a smoother way, and which we don't have right now. So maybe it will be the basic income. That will be, I know in America this is probably not very popular, but that could be a solution. Or we could have something like we have in Thailand, where Buddhist monks who are not engaged in productive work, right? Any man, and I don't think woman, but any man can take a number of time off, be a monk, and the community supports the monk. There's a mechanism for society to support this particular kind of activity, which is very highly valued in the context of Thailand. It was the same in the Christian Middle Ages, right? So we have to devise a system that allows people to more smoothly go in and out of the market in order to make this kind of innovation possible. Okay, I'm concluding. I promised to say something about Obama. That was more to attract people, right? But okay, I have to say something about it. Historically speaking, when a new mode of production arises, which is hyper-productive, it has always taken over the old system. Feudalism replaced slavery, capitalism replaced feudalism. Right. So I would propose a thesis that eventually peer-to-peer production, because it's hyper-productive, will replace what we have today. Now, how can this happen? First step is the seed form, and that's what we have today. Peer production is a seed form. It's important, but it's an emergent, marginal part of the current system, right? So let's go back to 15th, 16th century. The feudal system is imploding, and at the margins in the cities, people are reinventing new modes of production, which eventually will become capitalism, right? The second step was the 18th century. In the 18th century, the new mode had become so strong, so the merchants were going up and the nobles were going down. And we had a period called absolutism, because the kings became the arbiters of this equilibrium between a declining nobility and a rising, let's use the old word, bourgeoisie, right? All right. So that was a moment where we had a parity basically between those two systems of production. And then we had further the French Revolution, the American Revolution, where the new mode of production became the dominant mode of production. So here's where Obama comes in. The fundamental problem of our society is the following. We think that nature is infinite, and we have an infinite growth system operating with a finite environment. And this system is destroying the biosphere. Since April last year, we're consuming more from the earth than we're giving back. At the same time, we create artificial scarcity through intellectual property. We don't want people to share. We don't want permissionless sharing. And we're creating all kinds of legal means to prohibit people from those type of activity. This is a road to suicide. This is we'll have 2 billion environmental refugees in 10-15 years if global warming sets through. So this is what I call the high road to peer-to-peer. The hypothesis that at least some section of the establishment doesn't want this suicidal road and says we need to change something, right? And I think there's a chance that people like Obama will reform the system to some form of green capitalism. Some form of integration of the limits of nature within the current production environment. This is only going to work to increase participation and increase peer-to-peer dynamics. It cannot work otherwise. You cannot expect people to fundamentally change all their habits in a top-down manner. So this is, I would propose, the equivalent of the 18th century, where it will create an environment where peer-to-peer dynamics will move from being a marginal emergent seed form to a parity level or almost parity level with market economics. Third step depends on how we think of capitalism. So my question is loaded. You can only answer it in a certain way. So I will ask you, is it conceivable that an infinite growth system exists forever in a finite environment? If you say yes, then that will be the end of it. Green capitalism forever. If you say no, we have a fundamental problem, and then I think this sets the stage for a fundamental change, where the market becomes a subsystem for provision of certain scarce goods, but when you know for a logic of peer-to-peer dynamics. So what I want to do with the peer foundation, on the one hand observe it, and on the other hand nudge it a little bit, right? So basically this is the end of my talk. And this is, okay, so Obama is the high road, let me quickly say the low road of peer-to-peer. It's basically the Roman scenario. We have a ruling class that doesn't want to compromise, short-term thinking, let's grab everything we can, après nous le déluge, as they say in French. And we have an implosion. And then what we have is resilient communities, people on the local level, rethinking the way they think about money, local production, and we'll have peer-to-peer dynamics on the local level, just as we had in the fuel transition. So those are two different possibilities. I hope the first one, because it's a lot less painful. If you think of the end of the Roman Empire, it's 500 years, no roads, no pottery, no writing. It's a total implosion of the existing system. So it must have been enormous hardship for the people involved. So let's hope we don't have to do that one, and we can have the high road to peer-to-peer. Thank you very much.
That's enough food for thought, I guess. We have a technical problem here, so I would suggest that we pause for a minute, change the tapes, and then continue with questions.
Yeah. Stop it first.
Your comment. One and then here. Please go ahead.
I just want to ask, since you believe that P2P would take over our current market system, do you not agree that there are certain things within our society that P2P just can't replace, such as not just physical product, but let's say in physical labor, that P2P just can't take over?
Yes, probably. So the kind of image I want to use is in the history of mankind, we have basically 4 modes of interrelating with each other. This is from an anthropologist called Alan Page Fisk, Structures of Social Life. And he says we have, the first thing is equality matching. So I give you something, and that creates an inequality between us, and you want to restore the equality by giving me something back. And this was the basis of tribal society. Then we have feudal slave-based society. This is hierarchical allocation. He calls it authority ranking. The need to, are you higher than me, are you lower than me? Then we have market pricing, which is dominant today. And of course, in my hypothesis, we have peer-to-peer as a new dominant mode, eventually. The thing is that even though these modes have been dominant, successively in history, they've never been the only modes. Even today, when we have capitalism, but in your family, you're not practicing capitalism, right? In your family, you're a communist. You give without asking, and your kids can take what they want, basically. So we have market pricing, but we still have hierarchical allocation within a company. It's a feudal system. Yeah, the company operates on the market, but inside the company, there's no market. It's hierarchical. It's basically a feudal authority ranking system. So what I'm saying when I say P2P becomes dominant, I'm not saying that P2P will do everything. For example, in passion production, the things you like to do and the things you don't like to do. So the things you don't like to do don't get done, right? So if you look at the model of commons-based peer production, free software production is very productive, but it can answer a market request, right? So if you want something done, you've got to pay people, and then they will work for you. They will always work because they're passionate about it, but they will work for you for what you need. So we have like a core of commons development of free software, but on the edges we have market players, creating a last mile, if you want, right? And we see that in many different business, industry sectors. This is how it works. So again, we have the market, we have peer-to-peer. But what I'm suggesting is that eventually, the making of the car downstream is kind of not so important, right? That's not what will matter. What will matter is, for social innovation, is how people will compete to make the best possible design for a car. And that will be the core of our society. And the making of the car is kind of like a consequence of that core logic. So that's a way to see it. Yes. I'll let you decide.
Christina, you want to go?
Yeah. Rather to me, I just want to ask a question. I like the idea of this, but for me, there's actually a big issue: who's going to pay for the production of the car? Because I would love to contribute with all I have, but I still need to live. Do you know what I mean? I need to I need to have some money as well. So who's gonna, you know what I mean?
Right.
If I contribute, how am I gonna survive?
Okay, so the model I would look at what already is done in the free software community. In Linux, 75% of the people are actually paid, right? And they're paid by companies. So they're paid for the work, right? And then you can have two models. One model is, the old model is, I can say, I pay you and you work for this particular thing for me, right? And this is just ordinary capitalism. The code can be open, but the development process is not open. It's still directed to wage relationship. And this happens. But the other thing is happening is, for example, IBM, they say that they save 90% of their infrastructure investment because they use of free software, right? And of that 90%, very generously, they give back 10% to the open source community. And they basically have, I think, 5,000 people that produce Linux, but that don't follow the orders of IBM, right? So I spoke with several free software programmers. They say, yeah, we get paid, but we get paid to generally develop a particular piece of free software. We're not in a command and control hierarchy within IBM. So in other words, in fact, they have a basic income. Yeah, they have to work, but they don't have to work in a particular way. So they follow the community logic of production, even though they're paid by IBM, and IBM does that because it gets benefit from it. It's a way to repay the community, because if there wouldn't be the community, there wouldn't be a commons, and therefore they couldn't use the free software. So that's one possible model where you can imagine that there's both peer production and payment for, and then people, free software programs go in and out, right? They at some point, sometimes they're paid, sometimes the project finishes, they're not paid, but they still continue to work on free software. And so that's the kind of schema we need in our society as a whole, a mechanism where people can more easily go in and out of the market and get paid.
But what I hear you say is actually then that even though this is a bottom-up way of thinking, for it to really matter, you need like a top-down approach to it. You need the big corporations to change their mind and have them say, all right, we're going to give something back. because
Big or
the
small,
common
you can
person-
imagine, it can be a big corporation, but you can also imagine, collection of SMEs, of small and medium enterprises that could do the same. It doesn't have to be a big company. But you need a certain type of economy to, but okay, my argument, so today, peer production is really used within capitalism, and it's used to strengthen capitalism. Google is not in there because they are altruistic, right? They're in there to make money. But it was the same with feudalism and capitalism. Enlightened slave owners didn't free their slaves because they suddenly became better people. It made sense. But nevertheless, it changed the system to another logic. And similarly, nobles invested in capitalist production because they could make more money than by staying within a few. And so I call it netarchical capitalism. In other words, we have a section of capital which abandons intellectual property. They still have a little bit, but essentially they enable and empower social production to occur. And it's a mutually reinforcing relationship. Like in YouTube. Yes, YouTube is making money out of the sharers. The sharers profit from the platform, right? And there's a dynamic balance between both. YouTube cannot do what it wants. Because if it wants to enclose too much, people just go away and use another platform. Or eventually they actually create their own. In some instances where, and then you have a free software community which says, well, we'll make our own. So all these things are happening, but the result is that peer production becomes more important in this society. So it depends how you look at it. If you are a sharer in YouTube, you think, well, how can I share more? But if you're the owner, you say, how can I make more money? It's the same process, but you look at it from different angles.
I think it's a very, very interesting presentation. I want to thank you for that. But I was thinking the whole time it would be interesting to think through how this concept and the principles of peer production, peer-to-peer production, could be translated to the context and the situation of the poor, which is still especially rural poor, but also more urban poor, because you cannot make the divide anymore, which still represent about 70 to 80
Sure.
from 80% of the world population. And when I'm thinking about you telling the story about new kinds of production and production of added value, access to knowledge, information, and the creation of new knowledge is important in order for empowering people and for the creation of common value and for social change. And yet I still have this idea that I know that peer production has been existed a long time before capitalism, but not at such a mass scale.
It couldn't scale. It was limited by the physical limits in time because there was no technological way to scale it.
And yet I think it would be really interesting to think through what are the conditions so we need it's a condition. We need this technological innovation to make it work. And yet if we only make it work here,
Sure.
then we will increase the divide.
Yes, this is a real danger. But let me give you an example. And the example is just historically, in the Catholic Church, you have printing, and you have all kinds of people saying, no, they're wrong, right? So what they were thinking, how can we use printing to ensure our freedom of religion and thought, right? And they used printing strategically to spread their ideas. It was a tool, within their worldview to change the world to their benefit. So think about the average farmer, and like in Thailand. Okay, I'll give you an example. This happened last year. We had the chicken flu, right? Now in Europe, we think the chicken flu is a result of industrial production. Because we put all these chickens, we treat them inhumanely, and I think this is actually a right interpretation. But in Thailand, the farmers have no access to TV, they have no power. So what are they being told? The reason we have SARS is because of your chicken are free. So they want to, kill all your chicken and buy your chicken from Sharon Pokham, right? And this is because structurally, poor people have no access to media, and therefore they're dependent on the knowledge production of the government and the private sector. And they're not going to tell the farmer what's in the farmer's interest. They're going to tell the farmer what's in their interest. And the government, unfortunately, in the democratic system, needs money to get elected. It gets money from those people, and therefore is going to be more influenced by the companies than they are by the farmers, right? So what I would say is, strategic thinking is, for example, can we devise a system whereby farmers in similar situations with let's say rice, can share their knowledge and not be dependent on, but it's not going to happen by itself. It's going to be a result from people like you who think about this and say, this is how we strategically use peer production for our benefit.
But it's not only a matter about having access to this kind of technology, because this you see now, mobile phones,
Yeah.
And I think it's a great idea, but I keep on saying it's not just a matter of not having access to, it's also a matter of not having the abilities, the
Sure.
capabilities to deal with this.
Right.
And when you have access to, how do you deal with the information?
give you
It
an
doesn't come, the
I'll give
cultural
you an
shift doesn't
Sure.
come
I
from
give
one
you an
thing to
example. Again, you have to
another.
think strategically, right? So
Right. So how
assume-
can you develop
Okay, you have
peer-to-peer
literate
systems
farmers.
that can bridge that
we
gap?
should have, I think, in Thailand, right? Well, you use video. They don't need to rehear it. You use video bridging between farming communities, and they can exchange verbally in these things, right? So it's going to require, original thinking and adaptation, but it's not impossible. But it's not going to fall from the sky, right? It's going to. If you look in China today, workers, the wages are going up in southern China, at least until the crisis, maybe not now. And one of the reasons is that workers were checking the internet. The wages. They were checking and they said, oh, in that city we can get $100 a month, and in that city we get 150. So they would all flock to the other city, and therefore that would bring the wages up. And I think the wages increased with fourfold in 7 years, from 10 cents an hour to 40 cents an hour, right? So they were strategically using, even maybe unconsciously, just. So, I mean, in China you have workers, illiterate workers, using Skype to phone their families in the countryside. So it's a matter of leveraging those things and using them in your interest. But I think it's the way I see it is multinationals don't need it. They already had it. Since the 50s they have networks, but we never had it, right? So we can leverage these new tools to achieve equity with centralized powers in our interest, because now we have access to them. We can use them. I don't want to fetishize the internet as a kind of automatic thing, but we can do it.
Any more questions or comments? 1, 2, 3. Ladies first.
Could you talk about how socially created open money might be a source of creating alternative social markets, or perhaps dealing with a livelihood question that was raised earlier?
So the basic idea in peer production is you need open source raw material in terms of knowledge. You need a peer-to-peer energy grid, and you need peer-to-peer money. Right? Without energy you can't survive. And as long as energy is controlled in a centralized fashion, we're weak. Same thing with money. So money can be conceived in 3 different ways. Public production of money. Until the 70s, governments, I think, were creating the money. Today, banks are creating the money, right? They're creating, it's called fractional reserve bank. So you have $100, and this creates $1,000 alone. Then this guy will buy a house and put his $1,000 to another bank, and this bank can create $10,000 because he had $1,000 in. So this is how the system works. So we have private creation of money. But we also have a protocol in the money which makes infinite growth mandatory. If you have an interest-based system, right? So I borrow from you $10,000, but I have to give $20,000 back. So where are these $10,000 going to come from? Well, in a static society, it will come from somebody else, and I will take it from you and give it back to the bank. This is why in the feudal systems, which are static systems, the church and the Sangha forbade, and the Jewish religion, they all forbid interest-based lending because it destroys the social system. A static system cannot survive with interest-based money. The answer of capitalism is growth. So, because we're growing, I can pay back the $10,000 because the pie is getting bigger. But what is the problem? The problem is that structurally we can no longer grow. Right? We can grow qualitatively, but we can no longer grow quantitatively. So we need to think about the protocol of the system. We need to think about the rules of the money in order to have a different logic, to have a steady state economy where we take from nature only what we can give back to it. And this cannot happen with an interest-based capitalist money system. It has to change. Now the second part is of course, the banks will never change it. It's not in their interest to change it. And maybe we're not strong enough to take over the banks, right? But what we can do is we can socially produce money. Peer production is production of value by civil society. And therefore, we can imagine that instead of letting the banks create the money, that local communities or internet-based affinity groups can actually create their own software, because it's a piece of software, with different protocols that allow different types of exchange to occur. So that's kind of, I think, the philosophy of open money, which is about creation software that allows different rules. Because the important thing is, power in a centralized system is very easy, right? You have the boss and you have the underling. It's very easy to see because you get ordered. In a distributed system, you can't see where power is. The power is in the invisible architecture, in the design of the system, which promotes certain behaviors and makes other behaviors more difficult. So the way of thinking about power in a peer-to-peer context is how can we influence the invisible architecture through value-conscious design, value-sensitive design. How can I design a social system for diversity, autonomy, cooperation, instead of competition, etc. Again, all this is not automatic. It requires people to actually carry it out.
I have two questions. The first is peer-to-peer production and the model as saying a phenomenon within developed world, or is also a phenomenon in developing world. The second question is, currently we know even Wikipedia, the version for less developed countries is less developed. So my question is, who will create the content, open content, for less developed countries?
Right. So my answer would be that innovative technologies, by necessity, sorry, let me stop this. By necessity, develop first in developed countries because they have more resources, more knowledge, more technical abilities, right? But paradoxically, these countries have less to gain from it. So we see, if you look at again social change in the past, Spain and Portugal were the leading countries of the late feudal age. But the capitalist revolution happened in Holland and England at the periphery because they had more to gain from it, right? So what I'm imagining is that, let's take an open source car. So there is a Dutch project called The Common, and they claim that in 2011 they'll be totally ready with a working model for a car. Now, so they'll be looking for a party to actually make the car, right? Now, is Volkswagen going to be interested? I don't think so, right? But what about a Chinese tycoon, right? Who can say, well, if I align myself with this open source design community, I have my R&D department. And they might want to do that because it's a leapfrogging possibility, right? So, yes, P2P today is Western mostly, and only marginally, beginning to emerge in the developing world, but it's not going to stay that way. And examples are, how Africa is using a mobile phone to leapfrog over the landlines, and they're even creating money now. I'm not sure which country, but they are using telephone minutes as currency, right? This is a very innovative approach. So because they don't have the money, they use a new form of money. So this is the type of things we can expect to happen. Maybe not tomorrow, but you know, in 10, 20 years. You know, if people like you maybe go back to that.
Okay, there was one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah, to speak to her point and some of these other points, I think that one of the weaknesses of peer-to-peer is that it hinges on mass collaboration, it leverages mass numbers, but it also requires a basic infrastructure of an educated population with the cognitive skills to marshal the ability to then innovate.
Right.
And so because so few people in the global population actually have these skills,
Yeah.
you have a very small pool of people to choose from.
It's not that small.
When you
Well,
think
1
of the
billion
levels
people is not that small, right?
out of 6.5 billion.
Yeah.
Okay, so what I'm saying is that capitalism will dominate the landscape as long as mass education is not universally available as an infrastructure, and then the actual skills can emerge out of that. I mean, I think the argument I would make is the reason peer-to-peer is emerging in the West is because it has the basic infrastructure capacities to enable it to. So it's sort of a chicken and an egg, or a
Well,
carbon horse.
let me
before.
give you an example.
Alright.
Korea, right? Korea, about 10 years ago, you know, decided it was of strategic importance to develop a knowledge economy. And they actively educated their population. You know, 1 million teachers got educated, and then these teachers educated students, etc., right? And today, Korea is the most broadband-intensive country in the world. They actually produce. So if you take an average building in Korea, they notice that more goes out than comes in. So people are actively creating content, and they have games that have a higher GDP than 17 African countries. So they created a real economy because of smart policy, right? They educated their people, they trained them. So I agree with your argument, but again, you have to give agency to people, right? And peer-to-peer is not just an objective thing, it's a new way of thinking about life. In Thailand, I know an example of a farming project, I forgot the name, but what they do is they look at a farming community and they say, oh, this farmer produces twice as much rice or tomatoes, whatever, than the rest of his village. And they ask him to teach the others, and in exchange, you know, they don't pay him, they might help him to have a scholarship for his kids or stuff like that, right? So there's a kind of non-monetary exchange. For me, this is peer-to-peer thinking. It's peer-to-peer thinking. They don't have computers, but somehow there's something happened in some guy's head that he conceived of a possibility and a logic that he didn't think of before. And that's how it works. You know, psychoanalysis, right? It's a way of thinking of the psyche as a steam engine, right? So we have a template that comes from the technology, but then kind of influences the whole work because our consciousness is changing. And we are going to think creatively in a peer-to-peer way to find peer-to-peer solutions for peer-to-peer problems.
Heather, you have a question?
Yeah, I guess it goes to the, you started out the talk saying there was a tipping point, and this seems to be a crucial point, in fact. And I guess the question being, at what point does peer-to-peer become so pervasive that it has consequences for the whole system? And I guess I was just wondering about this idea, one of the ideas you put out, which was the intrinsic motivation as a fundamental aspect of this. And it's something that is hard to grant you, it's very hard to say, you know, when does something like that take root and become prevalent? In your experience, however, what have you observed as far as precisely that?
So I don't think I can kind of define, this magical moment where I don't know, I don't know. But what I would say is success breeds success, right? An example is, let's say, the Obama election. As people go back to how he did it, it seems that he not only did he use the networks, but he used it to mobilize people, right? So, for example, he only won from Clinton because in 2 states they gave people, 10, 20 addresses to mobilize people for the Caucasus, right? Okay, so this is still top-down mobilization, granted, but using those P2P technologies, right, for his own benefit, getting elected. But what it does is now no election will ever be the same, right? So success becomes a template for people to say, oh, and in 4 years Republicans will do it, right? They will try to emulate. And that's how things change. When people look at each other and they say, oh, this is working better, and it creates emulation, and it's like the sea level rises, and you won't feel a change. Revolution rises because the old system doesn't want to change, but it's not necessary. It depends, right? I imagine the French Revolution. People were behaving more and more capitalistically, and there was, well, we are hungry, but we can't do this and this and this because of feudal privileges, right? And then they get angry and they throw away the old guard. But that's not what a revolution was. The revolution was a slow, slow rising in the sea level of different practices, and that's what we won't notice. It's like when you're in therapy, right? You have a problem, you want to change, and then one day you say, oh, my problem has disappeared. Somehow, right? So it can happen that way. So it will depend. Maybe if we have Obama, it will be smooth, but if we have Bush in 20 years, it will not be smooth. It depends.
At the same time,
yeah.
Obama's election campaign won a major prize for its public relations and marketing, which tells us again that the technologies for persuasion on a mass scale are still a fairly
Sure. It's a totality of things, right? And it's also very crucial the way he uses networks. And the people who we mobilize have agency, right? So you can already see that a lot of people are saying, well, we don't want just to elect you. We want you to govern in the way that we support you in the election, and that will create pressure. And that's how change happens. The people's expectations change. And that's how companies change. They don't change by themselves. They become green when the people want green stuff, right?
Yeah, I just want to go back to some of the questions about, kind of the hierarchies that are built into the system and how they are kind of retooled into the peer production. Kind of the fear that, we have built structural inequalities, for instance, in a knowledge economy and, through education and so forth. And we may see these reproduced in the peer production, correct? And when you presented kind of a peer-to-peer economy or economic shift, you say, well, there is the public, there is the private, and there is the peer-to-peer. And could you elaborate? I mean, how do you see first? I mean, a role for the public policy side to enable, correct, the peer-to-peer, and other to somehow. I mean, I think that peer-to-peer we have to recognize that is set for reproducing inequalities unless we do something about it. Right. So unless we tap on how we redistribute, the wealth created through these networks, how we do it like a distributed network rather than the hierarchical network that otherwise would be.
That's a very tough question.
Yeah, because but I feel it's like I'm a true believer. I mean, of the peer-to-peer potential, and the more better, for instance, thinking about the dynamics of developed, world versus the developing countries, and what it means in terms
let
of
me give you a few answers.
Yeah.
First of all, I use a concept of what I call the partner-state approach. So, I'm not an anarchist. I don't think the state will disappear. But I think the state can be a kind of meta-arbiter between the public, the private, and the civil, right? And instead of the welfare state model, which basically says, we'll do it in your place, I propose a partner state model. The partner state model says the state should, because it's more competitive, it does, enable and empower direct social production of value, right? And so we have to pressure public authorities through elections and other means to develop these kind of policies that support the creation of social value through peer production. That's one answer. For example, after reading David Bollier's piece, David Bollier is a commons advocate, he's sitting there, and we kind of are aligned in many ways in what we think. I was thinking, so David thinks in terms of the commons as a governance mode, right? Using mostly trusts. So instead of saying it's a public property or private property, you say it's property of all the stakeholders that are affected by a particular thing, air, water, whatever. Anyway, and the second thing is, so I was thinking of 3 new institutions that we need. The first one is an Institute of the Commons, which would promote the creation of commons-oriented communities, teach them how to use licenses and all kinds of stuff, right? So promote this type of production because it's more hyper-productive. The second thing would be a entrepreneurial incubators. And my model is something in Toronto, it's called the Open Business Resource Center, where they help free software programmers develop companies and cooperatives that make money through free software. And the third one is an institution, I actually had a name for it, but I forgot, which rewards the 1% of the people who actually produce most of the value. Okay, take Richard Stallman of the Free Software Foundation. He got a MacArthur Genius Grant of $500,000 because he had proven that he'd done something important, and so they enabled him to continue his work. And this type of thing we need on a more massive level. We need a system, because any peer production project is 1% does all the work, 10% a little, and 90% just uses it, right? That 1% of the people cannot, peer produce sustainably without an income in the long term. And so we need a mechanism to feed those people. I'm speaking out of self-interest here. That do this kind of work. So that's one possible scheme that I was thinking of. How can we do this? I think we should look at the arts, right? The arts is very similar. In the arts, we have people producing value, which is not directly productive, right? You can't eat painting, right? And yet society has found many different ways to support art. I read a study in Canada that every dollar you invest in art actually creates $16 in value, right? So the conservative government, which is cutting art to save money, is actually destroying more money than it saves. And peer production is very similar. We're creating a new type of value which is very useful to society because it innovates and stuff like that. And so we have to find ways and means to support it. Think about Barcelona, right? It was a very problematic city 30 years ago, and somehow young people started to go there, and then some clever people in the city hall said, okay, let's give them lofts for free. And they created such a rich cultural economy for Barcelona that it became a world city, and now real estate has gone up 30 times. Of course, that's not good, because then, of course, the result actually creates a vicious circle, and now young people can't live anymore, and they have to leave Barcelona, right? So we need to find a different mechanism. But what I'm saying is this is a proof of concept to say to your government, you've got to support it, because this creates value. This enriches your community, city, region, whatever, and therefore you need to do something about it.
Yeah, I like a lot your thought about the for benefit, because certainly, non-profit doesn't mean that you don't produce a value, and furthermore, you actually could be an entry point for the market. And so the for benefit, or the for profit,
right,
can act as a distributed mechanism.
Yeah.
Right.
And
So what the idea of the Institute of the Commons
right.
would be more like an enabling mechanism, or
Yeah.
having people going through the realization of the potential of the commons, or
I also think that for benefit institutes have a political role, right? They are in some ways the representative of the peer producing community, and therefore they can fight politically for mechanisms which support, what is Free Software Foundation is doing. They're fighting for stuff which creates the possibility to get more free software. So we also need political mechanisms, you know, and that's what you are doing also, David, right? It's
Just identifying
It's
it
policy
as a
work.
sector of value,
Yeah.
which can then be put on the same scale as the market, and policy can defend it
Yeah.
properly. So it's almost a collective consciousness awareness issue as much as anything else, and I like
And
for
if I can say one more thing,
Yeah.
so I'm not against the market, right? I just think capitalism as infinite growth mechanism is sustainable. But I have nothing against the market as a, you know, just people making and exchanging goods, right? So I just want to make that clear. So I have a beef with the system which is towards the biosphere, but not with the market mechanism by itself.
Okay, talks and then.
Sorry.
Well, I think my question, basically is, it's interesting how you trace the, trajectory of economic shifts, feudalism and capitalism. And I wonder whether there was an epoch in, economic trajectory that we have trade by barter. And trade by barter collapsed. It was basically based on peer-to-peer ideology. This is what I need. Give it to me and I'll give you what you need.
Sure.
It collapsed because, for me, because there's an assumption that we're making in terms of human rationality. People have self-interest. And if we keep making an assumption based on human rationality, I foresee a situation where peer-to-peer will kick off or might not last. So I guess my question is, at what point what will be the contributing factor to the end of peer-to-peer, even before it starts? Considering that trade by barter was based on this ideology and
Right.
collapsed.
Right. I think it represents an evolution of human needs, right? And I think about my parents, my father. My father, in the industrial system, was happy to have a job, but it was a shitty job, right? But he was happy because it helped him sustain his family, and that was enough. And he had an identity as a worker, and okay. But today, if you look at most young people, at least in the West, they don't want a shitty job. They just, if they have a job which is shitty, they're not happy. Because they have evolved to have, like in the Maslow hierarchy of needs, they have evolved to have needs for meaningful activity. And what is increasingly happening is that if you're young today, there's all kinds of stuff you can do together, through the networks, without permission, and then you go to work, and you can do less in your job than you can do outside your job. That's one thing. The other thing is, I'm not saying we're saints, right? So we have a self-interested side, like in the narrow sense of the word, and we have another side. And what we learn in the networks is to share. We learn in the networks that sharing works better than that sharing works better than not sharing, because that's the logic of abundance within a digital network, and that changes us. So even when we then go in the physical world, we have a value shift that occurred, and
Let's pause for these simple
And so what
questions.
people, I think, increasingly are saying is, how can I extend, this happiness I find when I'm passionately working with my friends on creating something, and why is it not working when I'm on the job, right? And this creates a social force for change, I think.
Okay, the last
Yeah.
question comes from Ralph.
Just to follow up on what Martha was asking, let's say that there emerges a peer-to-peer network of designers, and in a year or two, they've come up with a wonderful design for an automobile. And it's now time to begin production in perhaps thousands of local communities, because it could be thousands of parts, and they could be sub-assembled or something. Who will decide which of the tens of thousands of communities that want to be involved in local production will be allowed to engage in local production? And how will that decision be made?
You don't need that. You You don't need any permission. It's like free software. Because the code is open, anybody can
You
say,
just start-
I'll take the design and I'll make the car.
They begin production on their own.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what do they do with it? They produce the part and then what do they do with it?
And then they sell it. And part of the profit will go back to the community of designers somehow.
Who do
And
they
they
sell
also
it to?
hire people
Who do they sell it to?
to you and me. Yeah. We're still operating in the in a capitalist economy, right? So this is not the kind of it's within the context of our current economy. So people are still in money, still have a wage, and within that emerge companies which instead of protecting their code have an open code, but they still make cars. And maybe instead of being a big multinational, it would be a local cooperative. I don't know, but that could.
That hasn't been, okay.
That is
I'm not
current,
trying to
right?
pick, I'm just trying
No,
to
no, no.
picture it.
Right.
Maybe eBay is gonna wind up assembling all these parts, I don't know.
It could. Now, of course, a car, it's hard to imagine local production of a car. Maybe it is possible, I'm not sure. It seems to me requires maybe more. But it's also that the people who are working on this are also thinking differently. They're thinking, how can we make something modular? Right? So today we have the Bug Labs. And Bug Labs is a kind of electronic device. And if you want a phone, you take this and this. If you want to make it in a radio, you take that and that. So they're conceiving in a totally different way how to make things so that it becomes possible to make locally, and they, for example, now we have something called multi-machine tools. Apparently, industrial production is basically 6 different operations, and now we're making highly specialized, very expensive, centralized capital goods. But these people are saying, well, let's make it a kind of machine which we can modulate, right? And once we have a machine like that, you can do it locally. So people are actively searching and thinking in new ways about how we can make things in order to allow this dynamic to occur. And that's going to take time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. But gradually we see certain sectors being transformed because open design communities are making things differently. Like Arduino is making these circuit boards. And of course, compared to Intel, it's nothing. But they did sell 50,000 of them, which I think is marvelous, right?
I'm not
and they
trying
rely
to-
on open design community.
Yeah, as you know, we have a problem in the automobile industry here. We're gonna put $50 billion into the solution. The cars aren't well designed. You could use if you have a peer-to-peer network of automobile designers in your pocket,
Yeah.
we could use it.
But I would recommend that, I don't know what his name is, 14 or whatever, goes to Holland and talks with the people who make the Common, which is a almost fully functioning open source car, designed for cheap, fuel efficiency, cheap production, etc., etc. It's actually designed by a set of NGOs, so it's a little bit a special project. It's a number of
Common,
NGOs which came together, and it's called the Common, but it's written in a weird way.
Is it in production?
Common.
I mean, can you drive one around?
But it was shown last year in April at the automobile show in the Netherlands.
There's a
And
prototype?
I emailed one of these people and they said we will be ready in 2011. And we're already talking with people about making it. Maybe he was lying, but that's what he told me. Or maybe he was optimistic.
Okay,
I don't know.
Can I ask just one last thing?
one last thing, and a quick one.
But do you feel that peer-to-peer will eventually destroy the market as brand loyalty? Since now anyone since it's open source, anyone can create a product. And so there's different product of the exact same spec.
It won't be classic brands, but if you think of Firefox, it's still a brand, right? It's an aggregation of emotional value, so it's still kind of a brand. What I think
But it won't
is
be
changing,
associated
instead of
with products.
companies competing to sell your products, we'll have open design communities competing to make the best possible car, and we'll have Firefox and Safari. We'll still have different choices, but the core won't be a company, it will be the community with a number of companies making this particular brand, of whatever.
Okay, that's a very nice summary for everything peer-to-peer is about. And listening to what Michel shared with us, and also observing your reactions, there is a lot of communication which is needed and taking place. So I think we as a news center also have a role to play in this kind of exercise. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you all, especially the people who volunteered to do some of the camera work. And,
That was a good
Good
example of
evening.
peer production, right?
Yeah.
Voluntary contribution. I hope available to all.
yes, hopefully it will be made available through ACTV here in Amherst.
More comments. More comments.
Good to see you.